Ever feel like there's a whole other world happening right under our noses, but we're just too big to see it?
It's true, isn't it? Like a hidden universe, bustling with activity.
Well, that's what I love about cell biology. It's like exploring an alien landscape right here on Earth. And today, we're zooming in on one of the most fascinating parts of that landscape.
Microtubules.
You got it. These tiny structures are like the unsung heroes of the cell. They're doing so much behind the scenes that we often take them for granted.
Most people probably don't realize that our cells aren't just these static blobs of stuff, right? I mean,
Right.
there's a reason they have skeleton in their name.
The cytoskeleton, it's what gives cells their shape and helps them move and organize all their internal components.
And microtubules are a key part of that framework.
They're like the scaffolding that holds everything together.
Exactly. But they're also so much more than just scaffolding. They're like the cell's internal highway system.
Ah, so they're involved in transportation too.
Oh, absolutely. They create these tracks that allow things to move around inside the cell with incredible precision.
Wow, so they're responsible for both structure and transportation. That's a lot of responsibility for something so small.
It is. And to really appreciate how they manage it all, we need to understand what they're made of and how they're put together.
Okay, so let's get down to the molecular level.
Yeah.
What's the building material for these microtubules?
It's a protein called tubulin.
Tubulin, okay. And how does that work?
Well, imagine tubulin molecules as these tiny little building blocks, and they link together to form long chains called protofilaments.
Okay, so like a string of beads.
Kind of. And then 13 of these protofilaments arrange themselves in a circle to form a hollow tube.
A hollow tube. That's interesting. Why hollow?
That's one of the things that makes them so strong and lightweight. Like, you know those bridges they build with the crisscrossing beams?
Yeah, I always think those look so cool.
It's kind of like that. The hollow structure gives them a lot of strength without adding a lot of weight.
So it's all about efficiency. Makes sense for something that's constantly being built up and broken down.
Exactly. And speaking of building up and breaking down, we need to talk about something called polarity.
Polarity. Like with magnets?
Kind of. Each microtubule has two distinct ends, a plus end and a minus end.
Okay. And what do those different ends do?
Well, they grow and shrink from the plus end, kind of like adding or removing building blocks.
So the plus end is like the active construction zone, and the minus end is more stable.
You got it.
That's so cool. It's like a constant construction project happening inside our cells.
Yeah,
But it can't just be random, right? There has to be some kind of control center, like a blueprint.
absolutely. That's where microtubule organizing centers, or MTOCs, come into play.
MTOCs, okay. And what do they do?
Think of them as the main construction sites. They provide the starting point for microtubule growth.
So they're kind of like the anchors, and the microtubules radiate outward from them.
Exactly. One well-known MTOC is the centrosome, which plays a vital role during cell division.
That makes sense. Cell division is a complex process. It needs all the organization it can get.
Absolutely. Now, all this building and shrinking requires energy.
Of
And
course, construction takes work. Where does that energy come from?
it comes from a molecule called GTP, which is like the fuel for microtubule growth.
GTP. Got it. So how does GTP actually provide energy?
Well, when GTP is bound to a tubulin molecule, it's like that molecule has a little burst of energy ready to connect to the microtubule. But once the energy is used,
The microtubule stops growing.
it can actually rapidly disassemble. We call that catastrophe.
Catastrophe. That sounds a bit dramatic, but I guess it highlights how dynamic this whole process is.
Absolutely. Microtubules are constantly growing and shrinking, remodeling themselves in response to the cell's needs.
So it's a constant dance between building up and breaking down.
That's a great way to put it. And all of this is precisely orchestrated to keep the cell functioning smoothly.
And this dynamic dance, it's not just random, right? I mean, there have to be some rules, some guidance to keep things from going totally haywire.
You're absolutely right. It's not chaos down there. Microtubules have a whole entourage of helper proteins that make sure everything runs smoothly.
Like a team of microscopic assistants keeping everything in check.
Exactly. They regulate microtubule behavior, influence their growth and shrinkage, and help connect them to other parts of the cell.
So they're like the foremen and engineers making sure the construction project stays on track.
Perfect analogy. One important group of these helper proteins is called microtubule-associated proteins, or MAPs for short.
MAPs, got it. And what do these MAPs do?
They bind to microtubules and act like scaffolding, providing extra support and stability.
So they're reinforcing the structure, making those microtubule highways even more robust.
Precisely. And they can also influence how quickly microtubules grow or shrink, which is crucial for things like cell division. But here's where things get really interesting. What happens when these MAPs malfunction?
I was just thinking that. If they're so crucial for stability and regulation, what happens when something goes wrong?
Well, it can have some pretty serious consequences. In fact, problems with certain MAPs are linked to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's disease. Wow, I wouldn't have guessed there was a connection there. Tell me more about that.
Well, there's a specific MAP called tau that's normally found in neurons, and its job is to bind to and stabilize microtubules.
Okay, so tau is like the reinforcement for those microtubule highways in our brain cells.
Exactly. But in Alzheimer's disease, tau detaches from the microtubules, and this can have a devastating impact on neuronal function.
So it's like removing the scaffolding from a building, things start to fall apart.
That's a good way to think about it. Without tau's support, the microtubules become unstable, and the transport system within the neuron breaks down.
And that transport system is crucial for the neuron to function properly, right?
Absolutely. Remember how we talk about microtubules acting as highways for transporting things like nutrients and organelles?
Right, like a well-organized delivery system.
Exactly. Well, if the highways are blocked or damaged, those essential deliveries can't reach their destination, and that's bad news for the neuron. It can lead to cell death and ultimately contribute to the cognitive decline we see in Alzheimer's patients.
Wow, that's incredible. It's amazing how something that seems so small, like a tiny protein malfunctioning, can have such a huge impact on our health.
It really highlights the importance of these microtubule-associated proteins. They might be small, but they play a huge role in keeping our cells functioning properly.
It's like a delicate balance, isn't it? Everything has to work together perfectly.
Exactly. And there's another group of helper proteins we should talk about, the TIPs.
Right, the microtubule tip tracking proteins. It's all in the name, isn't it?
It is. And their name gives you a clue about what they do. They bind specifically to the plus end of microtubules, that active growing end.
So they're like the guides directing the construction crew where to build.
Exactly. They influence microtubule direction and help them attach to the right places within the cell.
It's fascinating how much coordination is happening at this microscopic level.
It is. And it's all made possible by these amazing proteins that interact with microtubules in such precise ways.
So we've got the MAPs providing support and the TIPs guiding the way. What about the actual movement along these microtubule highways? You mentioned motor proteins earlier. What role did they play?
Yes, the motor proteins, they're the ones that actually do the driving on these microtubule highways, transporting cargo from one part of the cell to another.
So they're like the tiny little trucks carrying their precious cargo along those microtubule roads?
I love that analogy. And there are two main motor proteins to know, kinesin and xinin.
Kinesin and dynin. Okay, tell me more about them. What makes them different?
Well, kinesin typically moves cargo from the minus end of the microtubule to the plus end.
So it's moving things outwards, away from the cell center.
Exactly, like a delivery truck heading from the city center to the suburbs. Dynin, on the other hand, moves cargo in the opposite direction.
So it's bringing things back towards the cell center.
You got it. Like a truck bringing supplies back to the warehouse.
This is incredible. It's like a whole city operating inside our cells with construction crews, delivery trucks, and traffic controllers. But you mentioned earlier that microtubules also play a role outside the cell, in structures like cilia and flagella. I always found those so fascinating, those whip-like structures that propel cells through fluids.
They are remarkable structures, and you're right, microtubules are the key to their movement.
So tell me, how are microtubules involved in cilia and flagella?
Well, both cilia and flagella are actually composed of microtubules, arranged in a very specific and beautiful pattern.
A pattern, like a blueprint for movement.
Exactly. Imagine 9 microtubule doublets arranged in a circle, with 2 single microtubules in the center.
9 pairs in a circle and a duo in the center. It sounds like some kind of intricate dance formation.
It does, doesn't it? And this 9+2 arrangement, as we call it, is essential for the wave-like motion of cilia and flagella.
It is. It's like a perfectly choreographed dance, and the dancers are microtubules.
Yeah.
But how do those microtubules actually create that wave-like motion?
It all comes down to how these microtubules interact with each other. And remember those motor proteins we talked about earlier?
Kinesin and dynin, the delivery trucks of the cell.
Exactly. Well, dynin is the key player here. It actually generates the force that causes those microtubule doublets to slide past each other.
So it's like dynin is pulling on those microtubules, causing them to bend and flex.
You got it. And that coordinated sliding, that's what produces the wave-like motion of cilia and flagella. It's incredible, really, how such a simple mechanism can lead to such complex movements.
It's amazing. But how do cilia and flagella differ in terms of their function? I mean, they both involve movement, right?
They do. It mainly comes down to length and number. Cilia are much shorter than flagella and often cover the surface of a cell like tiny hairs. Think of the cells lining your respiratory tract. They're covered in cilia.
Oh, right. Those cilia help sweep away mucus and debris, keeping our airways clear.
Exactly. They work together to create a coordinated sweeping motion that moves fluids and particles along. Flagella, on the other hand, are much longer and typically only one or two per cell.
Like the tail of a sperm cell, right? It propels the entire cell forward.
Exactly. So, to sum it up, cilia are like the sweepers, moving things across the cell surface, while flagella are the propellers, moving the entire cell through a fluid environment.
This is incredible. So we've got these microtubules involved in everything from maintaining a cell's shape to transporting cargo to enabling movement both inside and outside the cell. It's mind-blowing to think about all this activity happening in every one of our cells.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to learn about these dynamic structures and the crucial roles they play in our bodies.
Well, I think it's safe to say that microtubules are definitely not just some obscure part of the cell that we can ignore.
Absolutely not. They're essential for life as we know it.
They truly are the unsung heroes of the cell, working tirelessly behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and taking us on this incredible journey into the world of microtubules. It's been truly illuminating.
My pleasure. It's always exciting to talk about these fascinating structures.
And for our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the microscopic world within. Until next time, stay curious.